Hello, and thank you for joining this session of the Climate Change Conference. My name is Brooke, and I'll be your host. So I am pleased to introduce Dr. Michael J. Risk. Dr. Risk is Professor Emeritus with McMaster University in Earth, Environment, and Society. As far as he knows, he is the only climate scientist north of Guelph. Dr. Risk has given talks all over the world as well as locally. Recently has presented to Probus, the Meaford Climate Session, the Graeber's Naturalist Club, and now today with us. His presentation today is entitled, How Bad Will It Get and What Can We Do About It? So thank you, Dr. Risk, for being here today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good day, everyone. Stay safe. Look after each other. My name is Michael Risk. I'm a retired professor of environmental stuff at McMaster, and I'm here to tell you about climate change and about the fact that there is not a lot of good news and that there is only one thing that will save us, will get us through this, and that is by following the science. Science is one of the very few ways that we have of obtaining objective truth, because science always depends on the data, which are obtained through experiments, which anyone can run and supposedly get the same result. Okay, I'm going to give you the tools, a guidebook through the forest of disinformation, and some tools to cut through to the truth. This is a young Charles Darwin in front of the Antarctic ice cap. One of these is dead, the other one is dying. Okay, we are in the middle of a pandemic. We may be in the third wave. One thing that we can say for sure is that those jurisdictions that have listened to the experts have suffered less from this. I hope not to talk about our neighbors to the south too much today, but the cost of mismanaging this epidemic in the US will be at least $125,000 per household, which would, where we live up here, which would buy you a good house. We could maybe be proud of this because we say it's science-based management, sort of science-based. Had Ontario followed the advice that we were given, which is pretty hard advice back in January and February, there would have been very few deaths. And some of the tragedies had foundations that go back in history. Recall that Harris privatized the retirement homes, and Harper closed the Health Council of Canada, ostensibly to save $6 million, which, let's face it, is just a rounding error. Now, we are facing, for the last 30 or 40 years, we've been facing a fire hose of disinformation. This is a quote. This guy, James Black, said in 1978, we have 5 to 10 years before hard decisions on energy may become critical. He worked for ExxonMobil. He communicated his research up to management, and management mounted one of the world's most effective and best funded disinformation campaigns ever in history. So the scientists knew the truth back 78, what's that, 50 years ago. And it was the suits, the lawyers, the MBAs that decided to fool us all. Now, there are a number of American so-called experts that are paid to lie to us. We have our own Canadian stable. And these people crop up time and the odd time to tell us there's nothing to worry about, climate change is normal. Tim Ball has a PhD in geography from Manitoba, I think. Tom Harris has a bachelor's in engineering. Tom cut his teeth working for the tobacco companies, telling us that smoking wasn't harmful, and he now works for the oil companies, saying that climate change is not harmful. Donald Laframboise is quite vocal. She is regularly attacks prominent figures in climate research. She has a bachelor's in women's studies. This is the Canadian team. They all have one thing in common, and that is that none of them has ever published any climate research. Notwithstanding that, they are well funded by dark money, and by dark money I mean oil companies, right-wing American think tanks, money that dirty money, and they're running scared. Right now, the unsubsidized cost of solar photovoltaic is lower than any other form of power. They're running scared now. They realize that their time has come. In other words, there is now no reason not to change our economy over other than inertia and propaganda. Now, here's how to tell the BS from the best. One of your most important tools is Google Scholar. So you type in Google Scholar into Google, and you get a heading that looks something like this. And then you type in somebody's name. Let's say there's some person who says, I'm an expert in climate, trust me. Type their name in, and then hit the little search button, and you'll get something that looks like this. This is a summary. And you'll get a list of all the papers they've ever written. You look to see if they've ever done any climate work. Next, you look at the number of citations and the H-index. These are both objective measures of, I hate to say it, how good a scientist is. And if they don't appear on, if you can't find them on Google Scholar, or if there's not much comes up in the summary, don't believe them. Now, some bad news, as though we needed more. I work with the oceans, so let's talk about sea level rise. You'll notice this is a graph of sea level rise over the past century or so. It has gone from 0.8 millimeters per year to 3.1 a few years ago, and is now up to about 5 millimeters per year. So this is accelerating. When we talk about millimeters per year, it may not be too exciting until we realize that millimeters do add up. Nova Scotia is an island in a decade. When we, and I realize now I've got a hilarious typo here. We rebuild all our coastal infrastructure. What's that going to cost us? All these people will tell you that, oh, we can't change our economy. We might lose a few jobs. Well, let's move Vancouver uphill. What's that going to cost? There are projections now that sea level rise by the end of the century could be 1 meter. 400 million people live within a meter of sea level. Temperature, we're aware of what's happening with temperature. Temperatures have already risen about 1.5 degrees above the Holocene mean. I do some work in the Middle East, and I can tell you that farmers there in the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, when they want to work in their fields, they start about 3 o'clock in the morning, and they wear winter coats because that's the only thing that would protect them from the heat. It can reach 45 degrees Celsius. Humans cannot survive a wet bulb temperature above 35. It will kill us. So we have already warmed about 1.5 degrees. We are on track to warm much more than that. And at 4 degrees warming, the Earth only supports 4 billion people, which is less than half the present population. Now, I work in the oceans. Here's some deep submersible work off the coast of British Columbia. This is a kilometer down. These are sponge gardens that we've just discovered about the past decade or so. And they're full of neat critters like little sponges and sea whips. And they are an extremely valuable fisheries resource. Most of our fisheries comes from these sort of deep water gardens. But, there's always a but, the sea where these gardens occur has now lost 20% of its oxygen because it's warmed. And so these organisms are not having enough oxygen to survive. And if that weren't enough, the CO2 in the atmosphere has caused the acidity to increase in the oceans, and the shells of these critters are dissolving. So a kilometer down, thousands of kilometers away, the impacts of climate change are catastrophic. Now, let's talk about catastrophes. The most significant mass extinction event ever in the history of the globe, much more so than the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, was at the end of the Permian. And that was about 250 million years ago. This killed 90% of marine life and 3/4 of all land animals. For a while, this was mysterious to us. We couldn't figure out what was going on, but now we understand that there were massive volcanic eruptions in Siberia. This horrible slide is supposed to represent these volcanic eruptions. These eruptions added CO2 to the atmosphere and methane. The acid rain rained on the continents. It caused nutrient runoff to the oceans. The oceans warmed and began to stratify. Does all this sound familiar? And we say that this was extremely rapid. Now, that's geology talk, 60,000 years. Bear in mind that we are recreating this in a century. Now, how can people talk about how expensive it will be to stop this warming when the warming will lead to the end of civilization and the death of most humans? Now, back closer to home and more to the recent, we see an increase in forest fires. We're now seeing bog fires. Bog fires are becoming more common. These are terrible things because they burn underneath the ground. They're almost impossible to fight. They release tons of carbon as well as methane, etc. They are a disaster for the First Nations, and they're not all that far away. I mean, this photograph is taken up near Parry Sound. This is a bog fire that now has been burning for a few years. A few years ago, we did some research on what's called the thermohaline circulation of the oceans. Now, these are these arrows. They show the water movement. There's the Gulf Stream going up, warming Western Europe, allowing palm trees to grow in Ireland. As the water goes up, it cools and it gets more salty and it drops down at the bottom and there's a return flow. So this is like a conveyor belt. And this is basically the heat engine that allows Western European civilization, that allows the French to grow wine grapes, for example. We found that a meltwater event in Canada shut down the Gulf Stream in less than 4 years. This plunged Western Europe back into glacial conditions where it stayed for 1,000 years. So, if climate change poses an existential threat to the human race, surely our governments are aware of this. Surely they're all over this. Well, Grey County was recently asked to spend a lot of money widening the rail trail so that larger ATVs could drive on the rail trail. Okay, it's not fair of them to make not fair to make fun of them in this one example, but it's also fair to say that our local governments are about 20 years behind the curve. I would hope that at least some people on Grey Council stood up on their hind legs and said, these vehicles only serve one function, and that is to let lazy people drive to places they could walk to. We don't want them here. We don't want the CO2 they produce. We want to reserve these pathways to establish our status as a cyclist destination. That never happened. Okay, this is a slide I used in a talk about 6 months ago. And because it has a rainbow on it, which is a symbol of hope, I just copied it over. Our ability to respond to climate change will largely be in the hands of our scientists, and we will probably fail. Let's look at science funding. Now, every scientist says he needs more money, she needs more money. And in fact, that's true. We support science at 1/2 the OECD average, and we support science at 1/2 the amount that we subsidize oil and gas operations. We took a horrible hit during the Harper government. Notice that the grants begin to decline. And notice this, now this decline about 2006 is a little bit artificial, because what happened is that the Harper government changed the rules. Up until then, we were funding what we call curiosity-driven research. They changed the rules. If you wanted to work on how Exxon can get more oil out of Alberta, you got tons of money. If you wanted to work on the impacts of oil sands extraction on the Athabasca River, you got nothing. So our science has been hamstrung, and it will probably take a generation to get back. Here are some bright, fresh-faced young people that I would like to introduce to you. Christine Ward Page comes from one of those places north of Toronto, Milton or Woodbridge or something like that. And she began, these are my last 4 graduate students. She began her study on the effect of sewage on the reefs of Florida. She now works on fisheries crashes and what drives them. Owen Sherwood, his research was one of the first to show that, yes, the Gulf Stream is slowing down. And he now works on methane emissions from fugitive oil wells, ones that haven't been cleaned up and probably never will be. Bronwyn Williams comes from Guelph, and she now works on things like change in Arctic ice cover. She's now a professor in California, sorry. Dan Sinclair came from New Zealand to work with me, and he's now gone back to New Zealand. And he has worked on things like lead pollution in the deep sea. It takes at least 8 years of university training to produce a research scientist, far more than to produce a medical doctor. This is not just like hiring somebody to drywall your bathroom. You have to plan ahead. These people all left Canada during the war on science. Now, back to the real world, so to speak. 20 years ago, BP hired a firm of PR Flax to craft a campaign which has now been called one of the most successful deceptive PR campaigns ever. And this was the carbon footprint scam. This was a campaign designed to convince us that if we just changed our personal habits, we could stop global warming. If we just rode a bike to work, global warming. Okay, there's recent research showing that if we did individually everything possible, eating a vegetarian diet, walking to work, wearing cotton clothes, blah, 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 we would produce 1/4 of the change that's required. We have to reorganize society. If you are now talking about waste management and recycling, you're wasting your time. The oil companies also ran campaigns pushing recycling of plastics when they knew all along that this was not possible. We need creative thinking, and we need this to be guided by science. Most local governments have a climate action plan. Most local governments have said we have a climate emergency. And the plans that governments have, most of these are just waste of money, because they have been produced by the sort of consulting firms that write reports for governments. And if you are a consulting firm writing reports for governments, you know not to make them uncomfortable. And governments have to be made uncomfortable. Talk to a scientist. We're now in semi-lockdown. There are thousands of scientists around Canada sitting behind their keyboards with the phone in front of them. Use Google search. If you search for flood damage, Ontario, search for drought, you'll find the name of somebody who works on this. Pick up the phone and call them. They'll be delighted to talk to you. Most of them are much nicer people than I am. Where we live, we have tremendous advantages. We have a good quality of life. We have a clean environment. We have lots of people with good skills, especially in construction. People will be moving into this part of the world in the near future because we now realize we can work from home. And if you're working from home, it'd be a lot nicer to work from a nice place than downtown Toronto. So we need to encourage, subsidize any activity that sequesters carbon. Tree planting comes to mind immediately. We need to use property taxes as levers because we need sticks and carrots. We need governments to start acting here. We need to get ideas into this. We've seen a lot of these sorts of signs around here. Stop the wind turbines, etc. I never saw a sign that said, stop the wind turbines because I have a better idea. Most of these objections were simply disguised NIMBYism, and we need to get past that. Why don't we encourage, we have the infrastructure here, we have solar panels, we have wind turbines. Why don't we subsidize a hydrogen generating plant so that we move into the hydrogen future as leaders and not followers? We have tons of bridges here. God knows we got lots of bridges. We have to replace them. I was quite surprised when I looked into this. Wooden bridges cost less than steel and concrete, and they last longer. So every one of the bridges we replace has to be made of wood, and the sooner the better. When we build the new houses for the people moving in here, we need to get away from concrete. We need to penalize the use of concrete. Wood foundations are a Canadian invention. They have a lower failure rate than concrete. They last longer than concrete. We should encourage the use of these construction techniques. We should at least consider rewilding, which means bringing everything back. Some of them may not be the best of neighbors, but we got to bring them all back. It's been estimated that if we rewilded, it's hard to say, 15% of the planet's landmass, that would stop global warming. We have to help the farmers because farming has to change. We need to promote regenerative farming, and we need to encourage farming techniques that store carbon in the soil, no-till, green manures, etc., etc. And we need to encourage farming that reduces the use of fertilizers that are synthesized from fossil fuels. So nitrous oxide emissions are an increasing climate risk. Citizen science may have a role in this. This is from Wilder Lake, which is south of us. Not only nitrogen is used as fertilizer, but phosphorus. And phosphorus is a problem in our water supply. The Wilders Lake Cottagers group funded this study that tracked phosphorus over time because they were worried about algal blooms, and rightly so. The skinny dotted line is the trend with time, and thank God it started going down, because the heavier dashed red line is the line that triggers blooms of cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are blue-green algae, and they are nasty stuff to get in your water because you can't drink the water, and boiling doesn't help you. You have to start bringing in bottled water because you can no longer drink the water in your lake. This is driven by agricultural runoff. We have to stop this. In this case, we do have a stick because there are regulations. But the regulations we cannot depend on MOE. Years ago, MOE was an internationally respected environmental organization. The Harris Common Sense government gutted it. They fired 80% of the scientific staff in MOE. MOE now will do nothing. So we have to do it ourselves, bring in the conservation authorities, hire lawyers to enforce the regulations. This is my beloved neighbor, Franklin Jackson, who just died a couple of years ago. And I'm going to tell you a story. Here he is helping build our house 20 years ago. 25 years ago, we had a rainstorm which was cataclysmic. It seemed only to have rained on our 100 acres, but it rained something like 2 inches in 2 hours. And this is a lake in our bottomland. It rained so much that the river rose up, took out a beaver dam that had been there for decades that we used to walk over. Franklin saw this rain, and then he drove to town, to Durham, which is 15 kilometers away, to hook up with his buddies who were having coffee in a coffee shop, a restaurant down by the river. And he said, well, boys, you've got about 1 or 2 hours, an hour or two, before the water will run right through this restaurant. And they said, oh, don't be silly. It'll never happen. And sure as guns, 2 hours later, the river rose up and ran right through the restaurant. So I would like you to imagine me as Franklin, and I'm telling you that you've got about 2 hours before the water runs through your restaurant. Thank you for putting up with me. Thank you and goodbye from, this is my wife and I. We are, as far as I know, the only 2 climate scientists north of Guelph. And this is on our wedding day at the Glenelg Town Hall. And since you asked, no local government has ever asked for our advice. Thank you.
So that was Michael's presentation, everyone. I'm not sure, I haven't seen any questions coming in, Michael, for your presentation, but just wondered if there's...
Everyone.
Oh.
Stay safe.
So if you did have any questions, we can definitely connect with Michael later as well.
I've got one.
Okay.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for that. Love that presentation. And it certainly seems that there is quite a fracture between the politicians and the big business people who make a lot of those decisions and the scientists. So I guess I'm wondering, from the speakers this morning, we've heard how much that relationships and imagination are needed to go forward. And I'm wondering how you imagine the reconnect between politics, scientists, and Indigenous ways of knowing might happen to reimagine how we can go forward.
That is, well, first of all, I must thank the moderator for muting me because I swallowed a carrot for my lunch and disrupted things. I do not. I'm not sanguine because there is. Look, we've known what we have to do. We have known what we have to do for about 40 years. What have we done? I have been doing what I can for at least that length of time. And basically have got nowhere. I think it is what I would like people to do is start. You got to start small. You got to act, think globally, act locally. You got to talk to council. You got to go to your local council and say, what are you actually doing? No more goddamn unicorns and rainbows. What are you actually doing? We will not solve this by joining hands and singing Kumbaya. We will solve this by sequestering carbon, electrifying everything, applying creative solutions, but you'll have to act. And perhaps by now you have a sense of why they've kept me out of all their decision making. There is a gentleman who's Gord Edwards.
Well, I would like to promote the idea, maybe, to Grey County that they stop increasing the size of the natural gas pipeline that is being built right now and is just going in the wrong direction. That's all I'll say.
Thank you, everyone.